Welcome to Dialogue. This conversation is part of a series we're doing on Trust the Experts. And today, we are focusing on perhaps the most important experts in our lives, medical doctors.
Right. The authority when it comes to our deepest fears and hopes, health, suffering, life, and death.
And we want to dive into this historical journey because for most of human history, medicine was, I guess you could say it was honest about its
Oh,
limitations.
it was terrifyingly honest.
Exactly. If you got sick, everyone was basically guessing. They used herbs. They told you to rest. Maybe there was prayer. But there was this raw transparency.
Unnecessary acceptance of loss, because it was obvious nobody had a magic bullet. The limits were clear.
But then everything changed. There was this huge shift. Medicine professionalized.
It did. It stopped being a craft and started to look like a science.
And the symbols of that are so powerful. The white coats appear, these huge institutions are built, and suddenly everyday language is replaced with, these intimidating Latin terms.
And that created a gulf, didn't it? It instantly separated the healer from the person being healed. It created an authority.
That's the inflection point, isn't it?
Yeah.
That moment is what really defines the next couple of centuries of medicine.
It's everything. Because before that, a doctor often had to look a patient in the eye and just say, "We don't know."
Or, this is our best guess.
Precisely. But once they wrapped themselves in the costume of science, the uniform, the complex tools, the big buildings, that phrase, "we don't know," it vanished.
And it was replaced with a demand.
Trust us. An absolute demand.
And here's the paradox that we're really going to get into. The more suffering became a science, the more the mistakes became protocol.
Yes, errors stopped being random failures and became these deeply entrenched formal procedures defended by professional status.
So this deep dive is really about that. It's about medicine's greatest strength, its confidence, and how that confidence, when it wasn't balanced with humility, ended up doing a staggering amount of harm to generations of patients.
Quietly, systematically, that's the key.
Okay, so where do we begin? Let's start at the very foundation of this authority, a system that ran medicine for almost 2,000 years.
Humoral theory.
Humoral theory. If you want an example of institutional certainty, this is it.
Oh, it's the ultimate example.
So this idea governed Western medicine from ancient Greece all the way into the 19th century. The core concept was that the body is controlled by 4 fluids.
4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile.
And health was just a perfect balance of these 4 things. Sickness was too much of one, not enough of another.
It's so simple, which is part of its power.
But what's so shocking looking back is that this entire system, which dictated life and death for millions, was built on nothing. It was pure theory.
Purely theoretical. I mean, they obviously knew what blood was.
Sure.
But no one had ever actually seen black bile or yellow bile doing what the theory claimed they did. It was an idea, but because it came from Hippocrates and Galen, the biggest names, it was
Right.
gospel.
And it wasn't just for physical stuff, was it? It was psychological, too.
Completely. The 4 humors mapped onto everything: the seasons, the elements, and most importantly, the 4 human temperaments.
So if you were sad, melancholy.
That was a textbook diagnosis. Too much black bile. Simple as that. If you were angry or had a fever, it was an excess of yellow bile running through your system.
And this wasn't just some academic debate. This was the diagnosis given to a worried family.
Yes. And it dictated a course of treatment that was, frankly, brutal. The goal wasn't a gentle rebalancing. It was often a violent expulsion of the bad humor.
And those methods were grueling. To get rid of the excess, they would put patients through a physical assault.
Repeatedly. They used harsh laxatives to purge them. They'd induce vomiting. Sometimes they'd starve them. It was all incredibly aggressive.
And here's the genius of the system from the doctor's perspective. The narrative completely protected the practitioner.
Oh, it was a perfect defense. The patient wasn't suffering from the treatment. They were suffering from their own internal flaw, their constitutional imbalance.
Right. So any weakness, any dizziness, the patient collapsing.
That was just proof the treatment was working. The doctor could say, "See, the humors are adjusting." It deflected any question about why the supposed cure was making the patient visibly weaker and sicker.
It's a brilliant and terrifyingly simple defense. And nowhere was this more persistent or more dangerous than with the main event of humoral theory, bloodletting.
The centerpiece. The solution to everything.
For 2,000 years, the belief was so simple, sickness, fever, inflammation, that all meant you had too much blood, a plethoric state.
So the solution was obvious. Get rid of the extra blood. cool the system down, restore the balance.
It really was the medical version of turning it off and on again.
Except you're draining the life force out of the machine. And think about how widely it was applied. I mean, what didn't they use it for?
Exactly. You have a raging fever.
Bleed them.
Trouble breathing.
Bleed them.
You're in a lot of pain.
Bleed them. And here's the one that is just, it's so absurd. You're feeling incredibly weak and exhausted.
Well, clearly you need less blood. That has to be it.
Bleed them immediately. That weakness is just masking the dangerous internal heat. The logic is it's completely circular and insane.
And the sicker you got, the more aggressive the treatment became because your severe symptoms just proved how severe the imbalance was.
And we're not talking about a few drops of blood. For serious illnesses, they'd go right for the vein with a lancet. They would take pints. The goal was often to bleed the person until they fainted.
Syncope. That was seen as a success.
That was achieving balance. And you have to remember, this wasn't some back alley folk remedy. This was the gold standard of care for kings and presidents.
George Washington is the most famous example.
A terrible famous example. In his last 24 hours, suffering from a throat infection, his doctors bled him aggressively, multiple times.
They took almost 40% of his blood.
And when he died, what was the conclusion? It wasn't maybe we took too much blood. It was his disease was just too powerful for our powerful treatment.
That institutional inertia you talked about, it's chilling. The protocol is sacred. When a patient faints, it's not a sign of dangerous blood loss.
No, it's a sign the body is finally surrendering to the necessary rebalancing. The system is completely self-protecting. If the patient gets better, the doctor's a genius.
And then if the patient dies?
The doctor is a hero who fought a valiant battle against an unbeatable disease. In no scenario is the treatment itself the cause of death. The certainty of the protocol ensures the patient bears all the risk.
That institutional blind spot, that refusal to question protocol, even when the patient is dying in front of you, it sets the stage perfectly for the 19th century, because that's when professional pride goes head-to-head with hard scientific evidence. And the price of that pride becomes immediately lethal.
Right. And let's start with one of the most frustrating stories in all of medical history, germ theory denial.
It's infuriating because the solution was so simple, but the refusal was just profound. The evidence started to mount that these invisible things, germs, contaminants, were causing disease, especially in hospitals.
The problem was never a lack of evidence. It was a surplus of ego.
Explain that. Why would they reject it?
Because many doctors, especially the high-status ones from prestigious universities, simply refused to believe that their own unwashed hands could kill their patients.
It was an insult.
A deep professional insult. The idea that these educated upper-class gentlemen were dirty and were spreading filth. They couldn't stomach it. They preferred more complex intellectual theories like miasma or bad air, anything but the simple, grubby truth.
And this brings us to the tragic story of Ignaz Semmelweis.
It does, a true cautionary tale. He's working in a Vienna maternity hospital in the 1840s, and he sees something that just doesn't add up.
The death rate from childbed fever, this horrible postpartum infection, is way higher in one ward compared to the other.
Exponentially higher. In the ward run by doctors and medical students, mortality could be over 15%. In the next ward, run by midwives, it was under 2%.
It's a shocking difference. And he figured it out.
He deduced the horrifying reality. The doctors and students were coming directly from performing autopsies.
On women who had just died of that same fever.
And then going to deliver babies without washing their hands. They were carrying what he called cadaverous particles from the dead to the living.
So he made a simple rule.
The simplest rule imaginable. Everyone has to wash their hands with the chlorine solution. And the result?
It was immediate. The death rate in the doctor's ward plummeted. It dropped to the same level as the midwife's ward. It was undeniable proof.
You would think so.
So what happened? Was he celebrated as a hero?
He was ridiculed. He was ostracized. His colleagues were furious at the implication that they were the killers. They refused to adopt the practice. He was eventually fired.
It's unbelievable.
And the final cruel irony is that he was later committed to an asylum by his peers, where he died from a septic infection, likely from a wound he sustained there. He died from the very thing he fought to prevent.
And the cost of that denial is it's staggering.
Yeah.
While the medical establishment was debating professional etiquette, families were burying mothers and their babies from a completely preventable infection.
It proves, with brutal clarity, that when evidence clashes with status, for a terrifyingly long time, status wins.
And if that was about dignity, the view on pain in that era was about something else entirely. It's about brutal cold efficiency. Let's talk about surgery before anesthesia.
It's something we can barely even comprehend today.
A major operation with no pain relief. But for so long, the medical view was shockingly callous. Pain was just a nuisance.
Or even seen as useful. A sign that the body's fighting spirit was still active. A good thing.
So surgery was performed on fully conscious patients. If you needed an amputation, they didn't ask for your cooperation.
No, they used restraints, straps. It was standard procedure. The screams coming from the operating theater weren't a sign something was wrong. They were just the expected soundtrack of surgery.
And because of that agony, the whole measure of what made a good surgeon was completely warped.
It wasn't about precision. It wasn't about careful technique. It was all about speed.
How fast can you get it done?
Exactly. The most celebrated surgeons were the ones who could amputate a leg in under a minute. The goal was to finish before the patient died of shock on the table.
This rush to finish, though, must have led to so many errors.
Catastrophic errors.
Right.
And of course, given what we just discussed about hygiene, a huge risk of infection. There's a famous, maybe slightly exaggerated story about a surgeon named Robert Liston.
The fastest knife in the West End.
That's the one. He was so fast that in one procedure, he supposedly amputated the patient's leg, but also took off his assistant's fingers and slashed through a spectator's coat.
And what happened?
The patient and the assistant both died of infection, and the spectator reportedly died of fright. It's an extreme story, but it captures the absolute chaotic horror of it all.
And when infection did set in, which it must have all the time.
Rampantly. But the surgeon never blamed the speed or the dirty knife or their unwashed hands. They always blamed the patient's constitution.
It's the same pattern again.
Always. They'd tell the family the patient was just too weak, their body couldn't handle the necessary violence of the treatment. Pain was framed as a sign the treatment was working, never as a sign of the harm it was causing. The system protects the protocol, and the patient's body is always the point of failure.
That mechanism is devastating. As we get into the 20th century, that same certainty is still there, but it attaches itself to new things.
Right. It's not about ancient humors anymore. Now the confidence gets wrapped up in dazzling new scientific discoveries.
This is the era of cutting-edge treatments that were, in reality, just modern poisons.
Embraced with reckless, uncritical enthusiasm.
Let's start with the discovery of radiation. The medical community's reaction was immediate and a little crazy.
Completely. When elements like radium were discovered, they were seen as these magical sources of energy. The immediate assumption, with almost no evidence, was that this powerful new force must be healthy.
It was modern, it was mysterious, it was scientific, so it became a cure-all.
And they had absolutely no concept of dosage or long-term effects. But the marketing was incredible. You weren't just getting targeted radiation for cancer, you were being sold radioactive products for general wellness.
Like radioactive water.
Radioactive water was sold as a daily energy tonic. They sold radium-infused face creams that promised to make your skin literally glow with health.
And my personal favorite, radioactive toothpaste.
To give you a radiant smile, a genuinely radiant smile. The confidence and the novelty was just total.
The story of Eben Byers and Radithor is the ultimate cautionary tale here.
It is. Byers was a wealthy industrialist, an athlete. He injured his arm, and his doctor recommended Radithor, which was basically radium dissolved in water. The doctor assured him it was totally safe.
And he loved it. He felt it gave him energy.
He drank multiple bottles a day for years, and the outcome was a horror story. The radium deposited in his bones and literally decayed them from the inside.
He lost his teeth, parts of his jaw just disintegrated.
It was a gruesome, slow poisoning. And when he died, it was undeniably from radiation. But even as this was happening to people, the treatment was still being defended as cutting edge. It was easier to blame the patient's body for reacting poorly than to admit the miracle cure was just poison.
The faith in the new science was stronger than the evidence of the patient's body being destroyed.
Absolutely. And this wasn't new for medicine. Radiation was just the latest chapter in what you could call medicine's long love affair with poison.
Heavy metals. For centuries, things we now know are acutely toxic were standard treatments.
Mercury, arsenic, lead. They were staples of the medical kit. And the reason they were so popular is because they produced a very strong, very visible reaction in the patient.
Which doctors took as a sign of effectiveness.
Exactly. If it makes you violently ill, it must be doing something powerful. Mercury was the standard treatment for syphilis for centuries.
With devastating side effects.
Horrific. Acute poisoning, tremors, your gums would rot, you'd lose your teeth, and of course the neurological damage. That's where the phrase, mad as a hatter, comes from.
because hat makers used mercury and went insane.
Yes. And arsenic was prescribed as a health tonic. Lead was used in cosmetics and even for digestive problems.
So when patients started going mad, losing their teeth, how did the medical establishment react? Did they stop using it?
Rarely. They just adjusted the dosage.
Of
A
course.
doctor might say, okay, let's try a little less mercury, or let's mix this arsenic with an herbal tincture. The core belief in the poison's power remained. And families trusted it because the prescription came from science. The authority of the doctor's note was unassailable.
It comes back to that central point.
Yeah.
The white coat didn't make the idea true, it just made it unquestionable.
And that leads us straight into some of the most invasive and identity-destroying procedures of the 20th century, where the human mind and body were just treated like a laboratory.
Let's talk about psychiatric procedures based on certainty. These were developed with this intense confidence, but they often sacrifice the patient's entire sense of self just for the sake of making them easier to manage.
Starting with something called insulin coma therapy. In the 1930s, this was seen as a revolutionary treatment for schizophrenia.
And what did it involve?
It involved injecting patients with massive doses of insulin to deliberately induce a deep, life-threatening coma.
The idea being that this massive shock to the system would somehow reset the brain.
That was the hypothesis. And the doctors who did this were incredibly confident. They were putting patients into a medical crisis multiple times a week. The risk of death or permanent brain damage was very real. Some patients never woke up.
And families agreed to this.
They did. They were desperate, and they were reassured by the doctor's absolute conviction that this was progress.
And from there, we move to probably the most infamous procedure of all, the lobotomy.
The ultimate example of sacrificing personality for silence.
And it was shockingly crude, wasn't it? Especially the ice pick lobotomy.
The transorbital lobotomy, pioneered by Walter Freeman, he used an instrument that was literally like an ice pick, went in through the eye socket, and just severed connections in the frontal lobe. It was fast, it was brutal, and it was done by the thousands.
And the measure of success was terrifying.
Success was compliance. The patient was no longer anxious or violent or disruptive. They became quiet, easy to manage.
But at what cost?
At the cost of everything that made them a person. Their personality dissolved, their emotions vanished. They were just docile, a quiet shadow. And when horrified families would see this shell of a person, the doctors would say,
It worked. They're cured.
exactly. Success was defined by the convenience of the institution, not the quality of the patient's life.
And that desire for control was also there with the early use of electric shock, wasn't it?
Yes. Today, ECT is a very controlled procedure with anesthesia, but historically it was often used coercively in mental hospitals as a tool of management.
And the side effects were just dismissed.
Completely. Doctors told patients the discomfort was necessary. Major side effects like severe memory loss and confusion were framed as acceptable or even therapeutic.
The idea being if you erase the bad memories, you erase the problem.
Right. But family members knew. They'd say, they're just not the same person anymore. They saw the gaps in memory, the subdued spirit, but the medical authority labeled it a success. The patient's subjective experience was irrelevant.
Moving from the mind back to the body, there's another story of catastrophic drug confidence that is much more recent and just devastating.
Thalidomide.
Thalidomide in pregnancy, a story of over-reassurance shattering lives on a global scale.
It was introduced in the late 1950s as a sedative. It was particularly popular for treating morning sickness in pregnant women.
And the key selling point was?
That it was completely, totally safe. Doctors were assured of its safety. It was marketed as non-toxic with no side effects.
And that absolute assurance was the critical failure.
It was, because the confidence was so high, the testing was not thorough enough. The drug crossed the placental barrier, and by the early 1960s, a global tragedy was unfolding.
Thousands of children were born with severe deformities.
Specifically, phocomelia, the shortening or absence of limbs, hands and feet attached close to the body. It was a humanitarian disaster that just shattered families and public trust.
What was the response from the medical community?
Quiet, late apologies. A withdrawal of the drug. The focus shifted to improving future drug testing, which was important, but it didn't really address the core problem.
Which was the reckless over-reassurance.
Yes. The doctors who promised absolute safety when they simply couldn't know. The entire cost of that certainty was paid by those children and their families.
And while thalidomide was this acute, horrible failure, There's a slower, more insidious failure that has persisted for centuries.
The dismissal of women's pain.
The idea that it's just in their head.
Right. For centuries, when women presented with chronic pain, their symptoms were routinely invalidated. They were labeled emotional, neurotic, or the classic diagnosis, hysterical.
The authority of the doctor was used to declare that the patient's own perception of their body was unreliable.
And the consequences have been enormous. Conditions like endometriosis, autoimmune diseases, they went undiagnosed and untreated for decades, sometimes lifetimes.
Families watched loved ones suffer while being told by science that nothing was physically wrong.
It's the humoral theory all over again. If the symptoms don't fit the textbook, the flaw must be in the patient's emotional state, not in the textbook's limitations. Science was certain, even as a person's life was falling apart from pain.
And that brings us to the ultimate abuses of medical authority, where certainty was used as a tool for social control and the active devaluation of human lives.
This is the darkest chapter.
We have to talk about eugenics and forced sterilization. This wasn't some fringe idea. This was medical policy.
Codified policy in the U.S. and elsewhere well into the 20th century. It was driven by doctors who, with complete scientific certainty, decided that some people were unfit to reproduce.
And patients were told this was for their own good.
Or for the good of society. It was framed as a scientific improvement. And because the recommendation came from a doctor, from an authority figure, patients and families were often powerless to resist. It's a terrifying example of medicine becoming an instrument of state control.
And connected to that, the idea that some people are less valuable is the history of using children as experiments.
Yes. We know that medical trials were routinely performed on vulnerable populations, especially children in orphanages and other state institutions.
Without any real consent or oversight.
Consent was just assumed. Risks were minimized or ignored. Families, if they even existed, were almost never informed.
And the tragic irony is that medical science advanced because of this.
It did. Our knowledge grew on the backs of the powerless. It's the darkest side of authority, using the vulnerable as a means to an end, with the cost of that discovery borne by children who had no voice.
So as we try to wrap up this very difficult history, it's so important to hold both truths at once. Medicine is miraculous. It has saved countless lives.
Without a doubt.
But it has also, through these systemic failures of hubris, caused unimaginable generational harm. And the common thread, the danger we've seen in every single era, it was never the curiosity.
No, it was never the desire to heal.
It was always that unwavering, profound certainty without humility.
That phrase is everything. Certainty without humility. That's the core of the authority problem. The system was built to reward certainty. When a doctor was dead wrong about bleeding or germs or a new drug, the system didn't punish the confidence.
It just quietly adjusted.
Exactly. The textbook gets an update, the protocol changes slightly, and the failure fades into history.
But the patients paid the price.
The patients absorbed the immediate cost. The families carried the grief. And yet, somehow, the fundamental trust in the system remained. Because the system needs that trust to function. It needs it to maintain its authority.
That's the key takeaway. The white coat didn't make the ideas true, it just made them unquestioned.
It was a shield that prevented the people with the most at stake, the patients, from asking critical questions.
So we want to leave you with a final thought on this. The most dangerous phrase in medical history was never a complicated Latin diagnosis.
No.
It was the simple, reassuring, and sometimes fatal sentence, trust the experts. Because when that trust is demanded instead of earned, it shifts the entire burden. The responsibility moves to you, the listener.
So the question becomes, what is your responsibility when you hear that?
What does it mean to ask questions? Not to be cynical, but for the sake of your own health and for the health of the entire system. That constant negotiation between necessary trust and necessary inquiry. That's really what defines our relationship with the medicine today. If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, let us know in the comments what really stood out to you in this conversation, and if there's any related topic or a new topic that you would like us to cover in a future video.